All right, everyone. So I want to talk to you guys about the prospect of civil war in light of an historical event that took place in June of 1948. So, first off, let's spend a little bit of time talking about what's currently taking place in Israel. For months, there have been massive protests taking place in Israel. And these protests are being done by people who are very upset with the Netanyahu government because the Netanyahu government is working to weaken the Supreme Court. The government of Netanyahu wants to weaken the Supreme Court. It wants to prevent the Supreme Court from striking down laws that Israel's right wing wants to pass. They are people in Netanyahu's faction who are religious Jews. They are very religious, and they want to see religious laws being imposed. For example, they want to impose a law that would force people not to bring in any sort of non-kosher foods into a hospital during the Passover season, during the Passover holiday. This is just one example. And there are a lot of people in Israel who are against this sort of thing. They are against Israel becoming a theocracy. They believe that Israel must be a secular state. So Israel is a country that is very divided. It pretty much is split right down the middle between right wing Jews who are very nationalistic and very religious, or they are extremely nationalistic and secular at the same time. And on the other side, you have people who are secular, who are liberal, who are moderate, and these are people who don't want Israel to become a theocracy. They don't want to see any sort of religious imposition taking place. Anyway, I believe that Israel could one day have a civil war. And there are a lot of people who would disagree with me on this. They would say, no, that's impossible. Israel is such a united country. But here is the thing Israel is kind of like the United States in the sense that, like America, it is very politically divided. And at the same time, Israel, like the United States, is an extremely armed society. So the American populace is very armed. It's the most armed population in the world. Israel is also very armed. The Israeli populace is very armed. The reason for this is very obvious. Israel has mandatory enlistment into the military. So everyone within a certain age group has been in the military. Once you hit a certain age, you have to join the military. You can sit behind a desk, or you can actually, be a soldier. And so, when they leave the military, when they leave the IDF, they usually keep their service weapon with them. So, almost everyone in Israel is armed. It's a very, very armed society. So you have a very armed society, and on top of that, it is extremely politically divided. It is religiously divided. You have secular Jews who are moderate, who are against the far right. And then you have right wing Jews who are very nationalistic and they're secular. And then you have right wing Jews who are extremely nationalistic and they are extremely religious. They are extremely religious. And so, with this combination of high tension in a divided populace and a populace that is very armed, this combination is extremely dangerous. It is a perfect formula for a civil war. Now, there are historical reasons as to why I believe that Israel could very likely have a civil war. For one, Israel had a massive civil war thousands of years ago. I think it was 30 something years, several decades, let's just say that, several decades after the crucifixion, there was a massive civil war between the Jews. You had Jews who didn't want to have a war with the Romans, and those people were butchered. And you had a war, you had conflict between the religious establishment and the zealots, and it was extremely bloody. And this was all going on while the Hebrews were in a war with the Romans. But really, people talk about the Roman-Jewish War as if it was just a Roman-Jewish war, when the reality is that it was more so a Jewish civil war. And it was massive, and so many people lost their lives. So many Jewish people lost their lives fighting against other Jews. Now you can say, well, Ted, that was millennia ago, so who really cares about a civil war that happened, thousands of years ago? Well, I am of the belief that not many things change, right? Technology changes, but human behavior doesn't change. And cultures don't change all that much. I mean, because it's very, very simple. You have a generation that goes through something like a really horrific war, like what happened with the Roman-Jewish War. Those people have children. Those children teach their children about what happened. Those children teach their children. And so you have some sort of inherited mindset that gets passed down. Now, there are alterations that occur. There are changes here and there that take place. But nonetheless, there is an inherited ideology that gets passed down from generation to generation. And there is a spirit that continues on. There is a zeitgeist. There is a way of thinking that is passed down from generation to generation to generation. And I think that people really continue on with this sort of paradigm. And when you have a certain circumstance that is formed around a people, those people will react in a way that is similar to how maybe their ancestors reacted to a similar situation in the past. But in the case of the Roman-Jewish War, it was religious zealots fighting against the religious establishment. In this case, in Israel, you have far-right nationalists and far-right nationalist religious people versus people who are more moderate. So in this case, if you wanted to make a parallel with what happened back in the past, it was the religious establishment versus religious zealots. And today you have moderates versus fanatics. So history doesn't repeat itself exactly, but it sure as hell rhymes. Now, there is an event that took place within modern history that was the closest thing to a civil war within the modern day state of Israel, and that was the Altalena affair. The Altalena affair took place in June of 1948. And basically what happened was you had, before the formation of Israel, so the Altalena affair took place not too long after the official creation of the modern day state of Israel. And what happened before the official founding of Israel was that you had these right-wing battalions. One of the most famous ones was the Irgun. The Irgun was led by a man by the name of Menachem Begin. And the Irgun were fighting against the British because, remember, Israel was at one point called Palestine, and Palestine was a colony of the British Empire. And so you had these far-right Jewish nationalists who wanted their own Jewish state, and they wanted to push the British out. And so they fought against the British. And they also fought against the Arabs. They dealt with the Arabs. And so it was pretty bloody at times. And after the state of Israel was officially founded, the Israeli government really wanted to put away these far-right battalions like the Irgun. So what it did was kind of like what Putin has done with the Wagner mercenary organization. The Israeli government basically told these battalions to be integrated into the IDF, the official Israeli Defense Forces. And the Irgun, a lot of members of the Irgun didn't want to do this. They were resistant to this. And so one of the rules of the Israeli government was that battalions were not allowed to transport arms. Well, there was a giant ship in France, and it was given to the Irgun by the French government because supposedly the French wanted to use the right-wing Jewish fighters as a proxy to prevent the Jordanians from taking over Jerusalem or something like that. But the French donated this ship to the Aragoon, and the Aragoon took the ship from France and traveled to Israel. And they knew that once they landed on the Israeli shore, that they would have a problem with the Israeli government. So they tried to do it in secret, but that failed because the Israeli government found out about it anyway. And then once the ship landed, there was a gun battle. And what happened was the IDF sent a message to the ship saying that they had 10 minutes to surrender, or there was going to be a problem. There was going to be violence. And eventually what happened was the Aragoon, according to Hillel Cook, who was one of the founders of the Aragoon struck first. And the IDF retaliated, and a gun battle ensued. Menachem Begin told his men not to fight back. Why? Because according to Menachem Begin, he did not want to start a civil war. So it really goes to show that right after the creation of the State of Israel, there was this division, and there was bloodshed happening not too long after the State of Israel was created. And this really was a sign of how divided Israel was even at that time. And this was in 1948. This was right in the beginning. Imagine now. I imagine that Israel is much more divided now than it was then. But there was a gun battle. The Aragoon fired on the IDF, and they shot at each other. As the Aragoon were on the ship, as they were on the Altalena, the Aragoon fired upon the IDF. And about 2 IDF soldiers were killed, and I think about 4 or 6 Aragoon fighters were killed. Eventually, fighting broke out in the city of Tel Aviv, and there were actual clashes between the Aragoon and the IDF throughout the city of Tel Aviv. So there was not exactly a civil war, but kind of a pre-Civil War situation was taking place. And if the fighting wasn't stopped, and if it continued to escalate, it would have no doubt escalated into a civil war in that country. But cooler minds prevailed, so to speak, and the fighting stopped, and there was some sort of a truce that was made, peace deal that was made. And after the fighting was over, the Aragoon lost, of course. The Aragoon lost over a dozen men. And after the fighting was over, all of the Aragoon battalions were disbanded, and several Aragoon leaders were put in prison for a short amount of time. But nonetheless, you had something close to a civil war in the modern-day State of Israel. And that story of the Altalena affair really indicated how divided Israel was, and it still indicates how divided Israel is today, because that past story was a presaging sign as to the polarized condition of Israeli society. And if you look at what's happening today in Israel, this judicial overhaul that the Netanyahu regime, and I shouldn't say regime, but Netanyahu government is doing, is truly exposing, it's shedding light upon just how divided Israel is. And so looking at the situation right now, I think it is quite likely. I think there is a high prospect that civil war will eventually break out in that country. I hope it doesn't happen, but looking at the history, looking at what happened with the Roman-Jewish War, looking at what happened in 1948, it wouldn't surprise me. Looking at the fact that Israel is so divided today, there are so many people in Israel who hate the religious Jews. My father will tell you that when he was in prison, when he was in an Israeli prison, that he would see these Orthodox Jews running down the aisle in between the prison cells, covering their faces as they were running, because the secular Jewish prisoners would literally spit on the Orthodox Jews who were visiting the prison. And my father asked someone in the prison, why are they spitting on that man? Because my father saw a Jewish man, an Orthodox Jewish man. He was dressed up with all the Orthodox Jewish attire. He saw an Orthodox Jewish man running down the prison aisle, and as he was running, he was covering his face because these atheist Jews in prison would spit on him. And my father asked somebody, I think he asked the prison guard, why are they spitting on that man? And this person explained to my father that the reason why they're spitting on this man is because he is a religious Jew and they are hated all throughout Israel. And this is still the case today. There is a lot of hatred against the Orthodox religious Jews. But the thing is that the religious Jews are winning in the population war because the secular Jews don't have a lot of kids. They may have, I don't know, 1 or 2 children per couple, but an Orthodox Jewish family could have 10 kids or more. So the religious Jews, the Orthodox Jews, are winning in the population game, and they are outpopulating the secular Jews. And so that is the reason why this right-wing religious faction is gaining so much ground in the Israeli government, because they are winning the population game. They are winning in the numbers war. So that really goes to show you how important it is for your beliefs, for your ideology, to have children. And so the secular Jews, the secular Israelis are being outpopulated. They are being outnumbered. And this greatly worries them. It greatly worries them, and it greatly worries them that that one day Israel could be a religious theocracy. So you have these religious Jews on one side, you have the far-right nationalists also who are allies with the religious Jews, but at the same time you have these secular moderates who are politically modern, and they don't want to see any sort of theocracy or any sort of far-right nationalist government imposing itself on the people. And so they hate what's taking place. They hate what's transpiring. And this hatred is very, very thick. It's very intense. So I wouldn't be surprised to see one day a civil war breaking out in that country. Anyway, you guys just heard some theology. God bless.